So, welcome everyone to Orr Group Talks. I'm Craig Shelley, a partner and the Chief Growth Officer at Orr Group. We're excited today. We do this really as a way to sort of bring together people that are talking about the things that we're talking about, things that we're finding interesting in the sector right now. And then we bring the minds and voices that we think are making the most sense on those topics, bring them together for discussion and introduce them to all of you. So today's topic around kind of big bet philanthropy and where it's been and where it's going is one that we've been thinking and working a lot on. And I'm excited for this conversation. Really, to me, is one of the bigger sort of opportunities and risks in the sector right now. So we're excited to have that conversation. We have two fantastic leaders with great policy leadership and fundraising experience here with us today. The first is Ana Marie Argelagos. Ana Marie and I have the great pleasure of working together, but she's an entrepreneurial thinker, great track record working within philanthropic, public, nonprofit sectors, deep expertise in community development with a real focus on expanding economic opportunity. She's the president and CEO of Hispanics in Philanthropy and was one of the early recipients of a Mackenzie Scott gift. So has a lot of insight just from her background and that experience. Next, Gabrielle Fitzgerald, the founder and CEO of the Panorama Group. Gabrielle spent her career working in politics, policy, philanthropy, really a recognized voice and thought leader on catalytic philanthropy in particular, women's leadership, pandemic preparedness and response. Gabrielle founded Panorama to serve as a platform for social change. Its mission is to maximize social impact by partnering with visionary leaders to co-develop audacious and bold solutions. We've been having a lot of conversations around this topic with Gabrielle's team, and they have spent a lot of time trying to think about what's going to come next in the sector. So I'm excited to have Gabrielle with us as well. So welcome, Ana Marie and Gabrielle. Couple of housekeeping things. I do not know where the bathroom is located where you are, but hopefully you do. So you don't need that housekeeping note from me. But two sort of functions at the bottom of your screen. You'll see Q&A and chat. Q&A, if you have questions you'd like to pose to the group, please post them in there and I'll incorporate it as we go. Sometimes if I don't get to it right away, I see it. Don't worry, we'll get it. And then in the chat, if you're having tech issues, you just want to say hello to the group. You want to say, wow, Craig, that was amazing. You look so great. Anything like that, you could say in the chat. But questions, let's put in the Q&A. All right, so big bet philanthropy. We've been hearing and experiencing huge potential for the organizations lucky enough to receive significant funding. But now that we're a few years into this, and it's generally defined as like unrestricted gifts of 10 million plus, but you're seeing gifts as big as 100 million, right? So I mean, it's really sort of scales in different ways in different places. But a lot of those organizations that have benefited and had their work fueled by these gifts, they're starting to approach, I guess, what we would call a funding cliff, right? These large, often designated and stated, this is going to be a one-time gift. It's amazing and it helps us do great work. But what comes next, right? We frequently see organizations scale up programming, not able to sort of sustain that funding level, and sort of then what? We'll post in the chat so everyone can access an article we did a couple of weeks back on this very topic, so you have it for reference. But as you know, philanthropy is evolving. If we're going to achieve true systemic change, which I know the leaders on this call today are very focused on, we're going to have to sort of figure out this question and understand how we can sustain this type of funding. So I'm thrilled to have these participants. We'll get right to it. Ana Marie, maybe share a bit more about your background and how it led you to your current role at Hispanics in Philanthropy.
Thank you, Craig. It's great to be here, and it's fun to work with you and now get to chat with you in this venue. So as you said, I'm president and CEO of Hispanic in Philanthropy. It's been a very curvy, zigzag journey to get here. I grew up in Puerto Rico and in Miami, daughter of immigrants, refugees from Cuba. So very much in a bubble, both in Puerto Rico, where we were all Latinas, so didn't know that I was a minority. And then in Miami, grew up in Southwest 8th Street. Again, this little bubble that was really insular because when you grow up as a refugee, there's always literally the suitcase is always packed, ready to go home. I grew for my first 15 years. But when I was 15, I was working in downtown Miami. And that's when I first... that's where I found my voice and my calling, because we had the Liberty City riots. And so that's when I first saw outside of our bubble what was happening, understood the issues around white privilege and how uh, those of us that were in the bubble were surviving one way or the other, but it was outside of the bubble what was happening. And so that just gave fire in my belly to go to Washington, D.C., because I understood early on that it had to be systems and we had to say change systems. And I started at community organizer. I then went to national advocacy organizations, which is Unidos US. I went to work for the government. I worked to work for Ford, for Annie Casey, and a bunch of great foundations. And all of that together taught me about how do you prepare and develop agendas where there's win-win. And that's what I think we're doing at HIP, really looking at the broader ecosystem and trying to figure out how there's a role for everybody. So in a nutshell, that's me.
Been quite a journey, and excited that we get the opportunity to be a small part of it these days. But Gabrielle, let's talk a little bit about, founder of Panorama. How did you decide to embark on that journey, and what, led you to it?
Yeah, so I always think it's easiest to explain why I started Panorama by giving my short bio. And like Anna Marie's was, a lot of winding roads that at this point, now that I'm a bit older, I can say I had 3 chapters to my career. And it seems very organized, but it wasn't at the time. So first chapter was politics and government. Right out of college, I worked on the Clinton campaign, which led me to roles in the Clinton White House and Clinton administration. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2 started when I was recruited into philanthropy to the Gates Foundation, which is what brought me to Seattle. I thought it would be a 2-year stint. I've now been in Seattle 20 years, including 10 years at the Gates Foundation and 1 year with Paul Allen's philanthropy. And then the 3rd chapter is now as a social entrepreneur. I started Panorama 8 years ago, and it really was building off all the lessons I learned in the first 2 chapters, including seeing that there was a gap in the social impact landscape where you needed someone. The hypothesis was that you needed someone focused on how you get things done as opposed to being an expert on any specific issue. And now that we've been around 8 years, that hypothesis has been proven out. We've seen a lot of demand for our work, whether it's on our nonprofit arm, Panorama Global, or our strategy consulting arm, Panorama Strategy. And the idea is they both work together to help support leaders in achieving their goals. So I can talk a lot more about it, but I'll stop there for now.
Fantastic, thank you. And I will preview for our viewers, listeners, I guess viewers. If the clouds burn off just a little bit, you're going to be able to see the Space Needle there behind Gabrielle, which is fantastic. All right, so Panorama, really focuses on building collaborative platforms, maximizing collective impact. With this in mind, what's your approach to fundraising, and how has it adapted, in response to the landscape?
So I think we're quite unique in that we are very reactive to people's needs. And it was really driven by this belief that there was a gap in the social impact landscape, and a comfort with, if there wasn't a gap, then I was fine with Panorama no longer existing. And I think that's actually a really core to our DNA, because we really believe that sometimes entities need to exist for short times. Initiatives may come and go, and we want to support that. Of course, it's really important to have solid nonprofit organizations that have very robust fundraising, but our place in the landscape is about supporting other people's work. And so we really work with others to support their fundraising efforts and to make it easy for them to do their jobs. So we're pretty unique in the way we approach fundraising, and really see it more about partnership.
Fantastic. Anna Marie, HIP's, a lot of different things, right? You're an intermediary delivering funds to Latin-led and focused organizations. You're an advocate for engaging more Hispanics in philanthropy and focusing more dollars on these communities. You also deliver some programs directly. Not an easy story to tell. How has that both helped and hindered your fundraising?
Craig, I really struggle with that. For this ecosystem approach. I was so excited when I met the folks at school, because they're like, you're a systems orchestrator. And I was like, oh, you get us. We're working in the system. But I struggle because it's so hard to explain. And so many people tell us, just focus, doing less is better. But there's so much, especially for an organization like HIP, which is working all across the hemisphere, right? Because we're working in the US and the Caribbean. We have staff in Mexico that's working all across Central America and LATAM. And so our ability to work as an ecosystem orchestrator, as our catalyst, is, I think, really our superpower. At our core, I try and tell the story. Narrative is so important so that people understand why we're doing all of this. And so it's about building, funding, and fueling. And so the building is building the coalitions, the collaboratives, the diverse donors that we help mobilize, building education, and all of the work that we do as what I'll call a PSO, a philanthropic strengthening organization. The funding is more straightforward. It's what people understand. So that's the investing and the leveraging dollars, and that might be pools of dollars that are come together from philanthropies and institutional philanthropies, or it might be how we work around crowdfunding and with giving circles and the everyday donors, which are just as valuable and important, because that's not just the amount of dollars, it's also how we're bringing the numbers of people so that you can really create movement and movement building. The last would be the fueling part, which is how we invest in capacity building and build the infrastructure. And we'll talk about that later, because if you just throw money, that's great, but without the capacity, it doesn't have the power that is needed to really create the systems change. So that's who we are. But yeah, we're struggling right now. We're trying to put together an annual report, and it's like, oh, it's too much. It's confusing. And how do you make it concise so that it can be understood?
Well, I think it is right. Yeah, and that pressure you get from funders and others to, sort of be more focused, be more narrow. It's like, yeah, that's great, but the challenges of the world are not focused or narrow. They're interconnected. And yeah, it's like if we have to do all of these things. So yeah, but it's a challenge. I mean, there are funders, like to your point, at school and places that sort of get it and even come up with cool terms like systems orchestrator to describe it. But your average sort of donor is like, what? But yeah, it's an interesting challenge. But that said, you all, Anna Marie, were one of the earliest recipients, as I said, of, that significant kind of funding from Mackenzie Scott. Can you talk a little bit about that experience, what it's meant for HIP, and the impact and opportunities that's, kind of presented in the current day because of it?
Thank you. It's a hard question, if I'm going to be honest, because I'm conflicted. Of course, we were appreciative, but we were we were the second cohort. So we got the call in October of 2020, in the middle of the cauldron and the chaos, and the Latina community, as you'll recall, we were in the front lines because we were the essential workers, a large component of the percentage of the essential workers, farm workers. We had so many deaths in our community. Our nonprofits were so courageous and really stood up to the challenge. But the families, we were both serving communities and also being impacted by what was happening in such a large degree. So it was exhausting and terrifying. And in the midst of all of this, in October, you get this phone call. And I honestly am jealous of those folks that receive these dollars now, because they can be strategic. We didn't have that choice. We felt that given that our community, wasn't receiving the PPP loans, our businesses, there was so much death and destruction on the front lines. We had to be responsive. And so we turned around and we granted most of that money right back out through our intermediary function. So we had to really beef up our pipes and our channels to get money out quickly and effectively. We had never, for example, given out money to the mom and pops, the taquerias, the bakeries, all of these, the little caterers, the daycare workers. We had never given money to businesses. So we had to learn, how do you do that? How do you do that in a way that the IRS wouldn't come after us? We had to learn so much so quickly, but it was really important because lives were at stake and communities were at stake, and all of the wealth that had been accumulated in the 10 years since the recession, right, of 2008, which we lost a whole generation of wealth, that all was being lost. And so it was going to really set back the community. So we had to be responsive with those dollars, and we put most of it back out. So that leads me to like now. And so we weren't able to be strategic. I don't know if we would have been, like, I read your article, which I recommend to everybody. Please do read it. We can talk about it in terms of like the Ford Foundation, how they have that build program. And I think that's really great, the money and the capacity building. I still don't know to this day if I would have had the capacity building and the strategy assistance, if I would have done it differently, because it was such a dire circumstance. I think the board and the staff would have felt compelled to put that money out. But what it did do was lift up the visibility to others, like the schools of the world, that, hey, HIP is doing this great work. They have a great track record. They can do this kind of work. So it was wonderful for visibility and for putting us in a space that others would know about our work. And for that, I am appreciative. But I wish there were follow-on because, I do have that jealousy of like, I would have loved to, like, I meet so many folks that are like, I put it into an account and it's still sitting there. I was like, wow. I didn't feel like we had that luxury. And I also felt conflicted about parking money during hard times and not putting it to work.
Yeah, I think organizations are making incredibly tough choices every day during that period, and you were facing down like, okay, we can solve problems today, or I can have a long-term strategic plan for how to spend this money or invest it. So yeah, I think you're right. I think faced with the exact same circumstances, you would do the exact same thing. So it's an interesting kind of dilemma, and I think that sort of being raised up and almost that sort of stamp of approval from some of these gifts and the double-edged sword that creates in some ways isn't something that we probably talk enough about, but it's an interesting point. Like, how can organizations better leverage that? But Gabrielle, I think that's kind of an interesting segue to, a lot of the work that you all at Panorama have been doing has really been focused on, what you've called these double winners, right? Organizations that got Mackenzie Scott and Skoll, or, there's a couple other things you've looked at and sort of put into that category, but like twice have been kind of recognized and invested in this way. Can you talk about why you've, undertaken this work and what you're learning from it?
Yeah, well, maybe let me go back before we got to the double winners. We were looking at groups like Anna Marie's to understand the impact of the gifts on organizations. So when Mackenzie Scott started giving away her money, which was obviously so unexpected, we said, wow, we think this is going to have a big impact on both the philanthropic and the nonprofit sectors, and we want to make sure we understand that. So fast forward now 4 years, we have not seen a huge impact on the philanthropic sector. People are not following in behind her, and there's almost been a backlash where people have said, oh, well, she's not putting enough strings attached to it, which I would argue very strongly that that's not an issue. But when you look at the nonprofit sector, over 1,700 groups have now received funding from Mackenzie Scott. And as we talk to them, there was a lot of commonalities. And so we've created 2 documents that it sounds like perhaps if you had gotten the money today, Anna Marie, this might have been helpful, but we created a 90-day sort of workbook of, here are things you need to think about as soon as you get a windfall gift. And then we created a playbook that really went through in more detail, here are all the different factors you need to consider. How do you engage with your donors? How do you publicly communicate? How do you, think about the financial options you have? And my colleague Priscilla has just put both of those in the chat. So if they're useful to anyone on this call, please check them out. But so there was, not everyone was in this sort of dire situation that you were in. And so there were common themes about what your board wanted, what your donors wanted, and we tried to capture those so that people could learn from all the good work that has been put in to date. So then that led to a question of, okay, so many people thought the groups that received Mackenzie Scott money were kind of the lucky ones. What about groups that have received money from Mackenzie Scott plus the Skoll Award for Social Impact, or a large grant from Co-Impact or Audacious? And were those groups, what were the challenges they were facing, and were they different from the groups that had received a single large unexpected gift? And what we learned from that research, and we've just published that about a week ago or right before Thanksgiving, a document called High Impact Organizations Trusted by Leading Philanthropies. We were looking at what are the common threads across those organizations. And what we learned was that those organizations had really taken the time to make sure they have their strategic plan in place, use the initial funding to invest in staff, invest in structures and systems, and really look at their strategies and decide with the additional funding, do they want to set up an endowment, a rainy day fund, go a little deeper or go a little broader, if they work geographically at a state or a county, or if they work on an issue, expand their focus a little bit. And so the common thread was that they all felt very poised for impact, but were facing challenges with assumptions made by donors who assumed that if you received either one or multiple windfall gifts, you were set. You no longer needed funding. And in fact, we found the opposite to be true, that these groups were actually very good investment opportunities for other philanthropists because they had really done so much to strengthen their organizations. And so the document that we put out in the list of about 50 organizations that met that criteria was really trying to change the narrative about the concept of windfall gifts or big bet philanthropy, that it's not one and done. It's the windfall gift is an amazing opportunity that really allows an org to really strengthen itself, but that's only the beginning. And we've been talking a lot as we've done this analysis about how this really needs to change the dialogue in the sector, because for a long time, big bets was seen as kind of the be all end all. And now we need to start the process of saying, yes, and those are great, but we are working on some massive systemic problems that just because you've gone from 5 million to 10 million a year, you're probably not going to be able to solve a huge problem like homelessness or inequity. So I'll stop there. I could go on a lot more about it, but I'll pause.
That's great. Very, very helpful. And it's been super interesting work to sort of follow you all as you've done it, because, right, like, I mean, and I won't say that this is, I would say this is indicative more of the organizations we work with than any work that we do. So I'm not in any way taking credit for this, but like, we've worked with lots of organizations as they went through the process of receiving and then dealing with afterwards. And like, I mean, I can remember, every place I was when I got a phone call from a client saying, I have to tell you this thing that I'm not supposed to tell you, right? And like the whole conversations that followed. But it's a lot, and it's like you're faced with lots of different decisions. So I think these resources that you've shared, are fantastic. And then you're also faced with what's next. And you're right. I think that's sort of a broader sector issue to answer. Like, we've got to figure out, like, okay, like, yeah, this you're right. It's not the be all and end all. It's a place in your journey, but what comes next, sort of, for your organization. So, Anne-Marie, based on your experience, Anne-Marie, what maybe would you, what do you think a nonprofit can do differently to, better yield long-term benefit from gifts of this kind?
I just want to say that I'm so excited about these resources that Gabrielle is putting out, because I remember we struggled. Probably spent 2 weeks with my board trying to figure out even whether we should announce it. There was so much anxiety, and there still, I think, persists about like, what if you announce that you have this big bet, millions of dollars, if it will attract others to come and invest, or if it will put a pause and folks will say they're set and go on. And our board never really, like, it was never unanimous. We always struggled with that, and I know that that happens as well. But what can we do differently? I think staying mission focused is really key, and really that's the time to maybe not do pilots that you've always wanted, as sexy and enticing as that is, but stay very core to your mission, and also balance that short and that long term. Because even though this is general operating and you can do whatever you want, if you can balance the short term needs with the long term, and really be disciplined about that, I think that would be helpful. I don't know if I would have had the strength to say, okay, I'm taking half of it and putting it away, while the communities were literally on fire. But in like, that would have been helpful, because we're still in fires and now the money's all gone. And so I can't tap that. And I know a lot of the organizations that built up to respond to COVID back in 2020, 2021, this first couple cohorts now are having to go back and close the work, the initiatives, the programs that they started, because there was never that follow-on funding. And so that's a real travesty, because so much work was put into that infrastructure that is now being dismantled, and we're very likely going to be needing, with mass deportations, with bird flu, or whatever the world is going to throw at us. We still need that infrastructure, and so it's going to have to be rebuilt. And so these cycles are just not healthy at all.
Yeah, and I think, to your point of like staying focused on your mission, right? You all did the thing with the money that was most aligned to your mission, but like at that time. But there's, different choices at different times. It's interesting, but yeah. Um, Gabrielle, how about funders, right? So, I mean, how can funders, what can they be doing to ensure, that these bets are, creating are going into an ecosystem that can sustain them? And actually, before you get into that, we'll make one other just note. Again, if you have questions at the bottom, Q&A, just put them in there and we'll get to them. But anyway, Gabrielle, go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing, and the reason we published this document a couple of weeks ago, is to educate people that a couple of things. One, if you give a large unrestricted gift, that's amazing, but don't assume that's the end. Or if you hear that an organization receives a large unrestricted gift of, $10 million, don't assume that your $10,000 or $100,000 gift is no longer necessary. And I think for the funders who are giving those large gifts, if they are sharing those messages as well, I think that's helpful. So that's kind of a really big thing that we hope to start to turn the ship on, because it's been a kind of standard assumption that, oh, you've received a windfall gift, you're good, you're no longer in my funding category, I'm going to move on to a smaller organization that needs funding. So that's one huge area of sort of education or behavior change we hope to start to make a difference on. I think the other is assumptions around absorptive capacity. We heard so much. We know that Center for Effective Philanthropy has also been studying Mackenzie Scott and the impact of her gifts. And when they published a report that included interviews with other funders, a number of them said they were worried about Mackenzie Scott's gifts because maybe orgs didn't have the absorptive capacity. We have found that in all of our conversations and in all of our research to be a complete myth. And, I think we've all known for a long time that's been a myth. So can we finally put that to rest? And then a third area is really trying to debunk the notion that nonprofit organizations kind of should have a natural ceiling and they shouldn't get too big. Again, the problems we're collectively trying to solve are big. And the political environment we're operating in here in the US is going to make those problems bigger. And so, this is very cliched, but we all know that no companies are penalized for growth, they're rewarded. But there's this weird sense in the nonprofit community that if you're getting too big, maybe you're too big and really should just stop. Oh, you're kidding. So those are some of the things we're trying to educate funders on about these large gifts, and where we are in the world today needs to change some of those stereotypes or assumptions that people had in the past.
Yeah, I always found that whole sort of line of discussion around like the absorptive capacity of nonprofits. I used to just think it was like the most condescending concept I'd ever heard, right? It's like wow, you weren't worried about your size when you were accumulating assets to give away, but suddenly you're worried about us. Now, are there leaders of nonprofits that don't know what they're doing and would not make the right decisions? Absolutely. But the same thing in the corporate world, right? Like that, the test should be, do they have the right sort of idea and leaders, not just this assumption, oh, well, you're a little nonprofit, you're not going to know what to do with this. So yeah, it's been super interesting.
I'll just add a brief point to that, Craig, which is we're aware of one nonprofit that has closed its doors after financial mismanagement, or I don't actually know the details, but one that has closed after receiving a large influx of capital. But that's out of several thousand if you look at the Mackenzie Scott and Audacious and Co-Impact and Skoll. So that's a pretty good ratio.
Yeah, that's yes, I agree. And there's also interesting too, that whole like this sense of like, was there stigma, which there absolutely was, of like, oh, now you don't need the money, which I do think for every person that said that, my theory or hypothesis has always been like, generally people want to be on a winning team, right? So like I feel like the ability to build momentum behind those gifts, and maybe it was what you did, right? And like maybe it's were you ready to sort of launch a campaign so you were able to get other people together? I've always thought that's been a big piece of it, to be able to say, yes, we just got $20 million, but we're working to try and do this, and it costs $300 million, right? To like be able to immediately say that, which we've had a few organizations do, I think was important. But anyway, so Gabrielle, as you sort of think about this, how do you think, big bet philanthropy, big philanthropists, how do you think they're going to evolve? Like, what do you think is going to kind of come next, if in the next sort of wave of philanthropy?
Well, I mean, I think we have a massive amount of wealth that's sitting on the sidelines. And so my hope and our desire in publishing these documents is to show that this money is being well spent. There are organizations that know how to spend it. And so I don't think we have any evidence that there's going to be massive follow-on to big bet philanthropy, but we have seen, in the past decade, I'm trying to think of where we were, all of the institutions I named, the Skoll Award for Social Innovation was the only one that existed more than 10 years ago. And the one I haven't mentioned is Blue Meridian. So those have all been created, grown, are giving out a lot of money. They all have absorptive capacity to give out a lot more money. And there's a lot more money sitting on the sideline. So my hope is that what's going to change is that these are rare and these are become more the norm, but we have a ways to go before we get to that.
Yeah, I've always had a theory that like philanthropy is kind of like a very copycat sort of sport, right? So like I always like talk back of like, all right, the Carnegies put their names on libraries, so then everybody had brick campaigns, so every philanthropist could like have their name on some sort of building. So I do think you're right. Like I think you're gonna see more of this. The question is, how long does it take, and does it get better, worse, somewhere in between? So there's a question that was posted in from one of our viewers. Let me sort of recap it. I'll take a little bit of a stab at it, and then I'd love either or both if you want to jump in on it. But with a windfall gift, how might an organization think about both addressing urgent needs, serving their communities, but also using the flexibility that funding provides to begin working on larger systems change efforts? So on the second part of the question, I'd go back to what Anna Marie offered earlier of like, stay focused on your mission, right? If your mission involves changing systems, then that's how you should be thinking about deploying some of this capital. If it isn't, you shouldn't decide to get into that business just because now you have the sort of money to do it. I mean, the counsel that I tend to give a nonprofit is like, I think you need to do a handful of things like pretty quickly. I think you need to invest in fundraising. That's a little bit like a shoe salesman telling you need shoes, but you need to. Like if you're going to sustain this in any way, now you've got some unrestricted capital, like put it into the thing that you always have to argue to invest in that can turn around more money. Um, and I would say, think about collaborating, right? Like as well, like what other organizations are kind of working on similar missions that you can work with to kind of advance what you're doing. We're quick to tell funders that they should collaborate. Doers should collaborate more as well. But I don't know how all would you answer that question if anybody has thoughts they want to jump in with.
I can jump in. Following on the absorptive capacity. Maybe you go first.
Yeah, so the way that I think about it, and this is incorporated in some of the things we've written up, is people, what people have tended to do, which I think is the right thing, is to fill in those kind of long-standing gaps. So maybe you've needed new technology systems, or people have gone a long time without a salary bump. Sort of take care of those basic needs first. And I put kind of a small percentage aside to do that, to sort of get yourself kind of whole as an organization, because that's going to strengthen your ability to do the things you want to do. And then I think it's look at, what do you want to invest in? Does it make sense to set some money aside, or does it make sense to invest in programs? I think in Anna Marie's case, there's kind of no argument. You're in a crisis and you responded to the crisis. But if you're not in a crisis mode, thinking about, do you put a little bit aside for an endowment, because is that going to protect you down the road? But these are strategies that people need to think about with their boards and their stakeholders. But I definitely think there's kind of the different phases to think about of what's the org strengthening that needs to be done, which includes fundraising, versus what is the programmatic versus what is the long term.
I can talk now. Sorry about my dog. I would, to your point, Gabrielle, about the absorptive capacity of NGOs. So I would invest in the infrastructure, both the systems and the pipes, all the infrastructure that is often like the last thing, because that's usually not covered by most grants. It's just not. But when I talk about that, I also, not just the infrastructure, but in your staff and in your team and in wellness. Wellness is starting to become trendy in some places, but really not as much as it should. And staff is exhausted, tired. And so I would really focus on wellness, so that your staff, you're not churning, which we often do, so that your staff is healthy. And again, that analogy to the corporate, in corporate, they are paying attention to wellness and into keeping staff, and how do you incentivize that. I would also really focus on governance, and not take for granted that your board members have all the tools that they need. And so I would invest in making sure that your board has fundraising training, has all the different types of trainings that they need, because at the end, they are really the ones that are setting strategic direction. And so they need to be aligned. They need to have the highest capacity. So you need to be investing in your board and in your staff both. Additionally, I would be doing some really bold storytelling, some narrative, so that folks understand what it is that you do. So take that money and invest in storytelling, and from different points of view, and storytelling, so that folks can understand and have empathy and have trust. And I would focus on building and mobilizing movements, so that there are not just like the foundations know what you're doing, but really you have a movements that can be activated and that are strong, and that can be, deployed in different ways when needed for different reasons. That's how I would think about it in hindsight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Super helpful. We're going to take another question here from the chat. Anna from Sightsavers has asked a question near and dear to my heart, so I appreciate that, Anna. Says, thank you all so much for this. I probably didn't need to read that part, but that was self-serving. So she thinks it's a great session. But anyway, what more do you think we could do as a group to support big bet donors to encourage their own network to provide follow-on funding? Yeah, and I'm like, I have a little bit of an obsession with this of like, I would love to see an ecosystem sort of create or form where it's like, I know I'm giving $50 million this year or over 3 years, let's make up numbers, to this organization as a bet. And I've already secured this next organization that's going to give $20 million the following 3 years, right? Like they kind of come together in a pack and sort of do that. I don't know if there's any reality that that ever happens in, but to me, it felt sort of smart. But I don't know, how would people react to this idea of getting donors to sort of encourage their own, encourage other donors to sort of follow on with funding?
So I think that's an interesting point, and there was an article written about that this summer in SSIR on funders fundraising. And so I think it's kind of a careful balance where it's amazing for funders to encourage other funders to follow in their footsteps. But I think what we're seeing simultaneously is almost funders becoming fundraisers and then supporting their own initiatives as opposed to supporting established nonprofits. So I would make that difference. I think nonprofits coming together and making this case and sort of having collective action is really helpful. And that's why in our work that we published a couple of weeks ago, we highlighted 50+ organizations that meet this criteria of what we called high impact organizations trusted by philanthropists. And of course, this isn't an exclusive or kind of end all list, but it's trying to make the case that people are having common experiences so that you as a nonprofit leader don't have to feel like you're making, you're kind of yelling into the wind, and you can sort of point to people that are having that collective action. So that's one way to answer the question.
Yeah, and it's, sometimes I feel like we're kind of a canary in a coal mine on like what clients are coming to us and what they want to do. And this idea of funders becoming fundraisers, I've had more conversations and projects, in the last year and a half doing that than I would have ever imagined would ever exist. And there's an ask here in the chat for a link to that article. I'm just going to post it to everybody here, so you've got it. Okay.
I really appreciate that when that happens. So I know it's weird and not the usual, but when I have funders that do introduce me to others, that's the highest testimonial and affirming our values. That makes sense. And also when board members of trustees recommend and do that, I appreciate it.
Yeah. There's a comment in the chat here too about people turning down money or sort of with something like I generally refer to now as like we've for a long time had gift acceptance policies, this idea of donor acceptance policies. Do you want to sort of decide source of funds, what types of donors you want to associate with? I absolutely think every organization should have that conversation and sort of set their parameters so they don't have to make these decisions as kind of one-offs or at the mercy of the mob, for lack of a better term, when somebody just gets upset about something. But I would also say, like, draw the line carefully, because you go back far enough, there's not a lot of clean money in this world, right? So just be thoughtful about that before you, get too rigid about what money you will and won't take. And my philosophy's always been kind of the Robin Hood, not Robin Hood Foundation, Robin Hood, the guy in the green tights with the bow and arrow of, let's steal from the rich and give to the poor. I've got no problem with that. But anyway, okay, one more question here, or a couple more here in the Q&A, which is great. Thank you. Have windfall gifts had any impact on spurring collaborations between nonprofits? It seems HIP did take some advantage of that opportunity. So, Anna Marie, how would you react to that?
I don't know how you would define the word spur. We were already very collaborative, so it allowed us to deepen collaborations, but I don't think it changed our approach. And it went from, oh, we do our own thing and now we can collaborate. It allowed us to bring some of the flexible dollars that collaborations need that nobody has. So you're, doing all the work. So the collaborations sometimes need a staff person to be able to keep the trains moving and things like that. So it facilitated a collaborative approach, but it didn't initiate or started off. It didn't create that from scratch. I think it was already there. And I don't believe in false collaborations that are donor required. I don't think that ever works.
Yeah, the sort of shotgun marriage collaborations of the funder kind of makes you do it. I will say one really cool collaboration that I'm going to plug, because Anna Marie's probably too modest to do it. But so Hispanics in Philanthropy, which has always had a great conference, is actually doing their conference this spring, along with Native Americans in Philanthropy. I'm psyched about it. So go look it up online. You should be there. It's gonna be fun, and it's gonna be in New Mexico. So what do you have to lose? But anyway, Gabrielle, anything you would add on that idea of nonprofits sort of being spurred to collaborate or starting to collaborate more after gifts?
Yeah, one thing that we've heard in talking to some of the hundreds of leaders who have received these large gifts is, to Anna Marie's point, they're not starting the collaboration, but they're sometimes re-granting to their partners because they recognize that if they are lucky enough to have been recognized with a large gift, they know they can't do it alone. And so they are sometimes using their funds to support their partners because they recognize it needs to be an ecosystem approach. And just because they were the one group that was selected for the funding, they need to bring their other key stakeholders along with them. So we definitely have heard numerous examples of that.
Very cool. I'm looking, I know there's a request in the chat for a link to the HIP conference. Oh, there you go. You got it. Thank you. Somebody put it for you. All right. Another question that's I'm super excited about, because apparently I'm obsessed about a lot of things, because I'm now obsessed about this topic as well. But the question that we got here is, have these transformational gifts been shown to decrease the scarcity mentality so pervasive ingrained in the nonprofit sector? And I would say, that is one of the most crippling things in the sector, and a thing most of us live with throughout our careers and don't even realize. Not to belabor you, I spent a lot of my career working for the Boy Scouts, loved the organization, did great things for me as a kid, but was absolutely a shrinking organization for the whole 16 years I worked there. So I lived in this scarcity mentality. And people ask me what was the biggest change when I came to Orr Group 11 years ago. It was going into an environment where not only did we think we were going to grow, we expected to grow, and we made decisions as if we always were going to have more resources. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I should have done this my whole life and I would have had way more resources. So I don't know. Have we seen these gifts kind of impact that scarcity mentality? I have a thought, but I'd be curious what you all think first.
I don't see that has happened, even though it's $300 billion that Mackenzie Scott has put out, her alone. After 3 or 4 years, organizations are in the same situation, many of them that I'm seeing, that I'm talking to, as they were before. But so I don't think the gifts alone are what changes that. I think it's the collaborations and the trust that organizations have as you work together, that you, in working together, you understand and you are working collaboratively to change what the pie looks like and make the pie bigger and change the slices. So, for example, I'm on the Change Philanthropy. I'm on the executive committee. That's all the groups that, another great conference that will be in October in Minnesota. And we work so that pie gets bigger, so that we don't go from a scarcity mentality, but from an asset frame. But you have to have, I think, trust and relationships to be able to do that and to do it at scale. I don't think it has anything to do with the gifts.
Interesting. Gabrielle, any thoughts on that?
I would say, I think sadly, it's a very short alleviation of that mindset, because the 3 or the 5 years comes really quickly. And again, I think that's where we're trying to share as much as we can so that people can get ahead of that. We've really stopped using the word financial cliff. I've been calling it an emotional cliff because it's financial cliff makes it sound like people are wake up one day and they're shocked that money is ending. And of course, that's not the case. But I have seen that people really believe that this windfall gift is the start of something bigger. And they hope that they've kind of reached their next level. And so when they've gotten through the 3 years and they haven't seen follow-on funding and they've seen some of their funders drop off, it's a bit of an emotional cliff. So it gets right back to the scarcity mindset. I wish I had a different answer, but unfortunately, I think that's true.
Gabrielle, that's so good because, for example, for 3 or 4 years, 5 years, whatever, staff is used to being told yes and dream big and we can do this. And then you go from that to like, no, cut. So your staff is feeling very whiplashed, and that's really hard to maneuver. So I would say that. I also have talked to several CEOs who put it into, into the bank for long-term sustainability. And so nothing really changed in how they were operating. And it's very interesting because those CEOs are getting pushed every time they say no to their staff that we can't do this, we can't do that, because they're trying to be disciplined. And the staff is like, but why do we have, $3 million or $5 million in the bank? We can do that. So the CEOs get a lot of pressure of like, why are you telling us no if we have these dollars parked? So it's a lot of it's a lot of conflict, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think, like, at the end of the day, it's a mindset, right? So it doesn't have often a lot of bearing in reality. So you're right, there are periods of time where suddenly no's become yeses because you got gifts like that. But if you tend to live in the reality that most of us have lived in, which you're in some ways almost always chasing the next payroll sometimes in this kind of business, right? Like it's hard to not operate in that sort of scarcity mindset. But boy, when you see the organizations that can sort of either just push their culture out of it or fund their way out of it or whatever they do and they don't operate that way, man, like you have to think of a place like a Charity Water, right? Like, I mean, from everything, my experience, like they don't operate like that and they never have. And like, wow, like that must be not only a fun place to work, I bet you can do a lot more. So it is, again, it's more cultural than anything else, I think, in organizations and in the sector, but it's an interesting thing to think more about. So I appreciate the anonymous person that posted that question. All right, we're coming to the end here. I want to be mindful of getting everybody out of here on time. Any final thoughts that Gabrielle or Anna Marie that you would want to share with folks out there before we wrap up? And it's okay if the answer is no.
Well, okay, I'll plug since you plugged the conference, so thank you. HIP is in a very unique role in what we add to the sector. So I would encourage folks who aren't familiar with us take a look, because we are at that in the middle of this intermediary PSO, like all of what we do in terms of the ecosystem. So I'd love to invite everybody to join us and to be part of our movement. Now more than ever, that's going to be really, really important, whether you're interested in what's happening in the US or whether you're interested in what's happening in Mexico, Latam, and the Caribbean, because problems are not usually just isolated. There's systems and root causes. For example, when you talk about migration and you think about like, why is migration happening? And you don't usually put like migration and climate change together. It's one of the things that we do because climate change is a driver for why migration is often happening and things like that. So it's a wonderful space to really explore what you think and why things are happening, and really do that with like-minded movement leaders and others that are in this space. So it's a great place to be, and come to New Mexico next summer in June 16, 17, and 18.
I love like this is like my childhood dreams coming true. Like this is becoming a real talk show. People have plugs and everything. This is fantastic. But Gabrielle, any closing thoughts?
I guess I'll just put in a plug for the materials that we shared via the links, but I think more importantly than the materials, I just hope we can start to really change the dialogue around the sort of treating windfall gifts or big bad gifts as they're almost seen as the pinnacle. I think we need to stop treating it that way and understand that it's one step on the ladder or the journey, and that those organizations that receive them need ongoing resources. First, encourage funders to give more of them, and to understand that it's not the end of the road. So those are my plugs.
All right. Well, I really appreciate both of you being here with us. I appreciate everybody that's joined and listened in. I see lots of familiar names there. So thank you, friends. And if I haven't met you, hopefully I will. You'll get a recording of this, the participants, and then, tell your friends, watch your email. You'll get invited to other events like this. Hopefully we'll have some good topics next year for you. But that's all we got for today. So thank you, everybody. Let's go raise some money and do some good in the world.
Thank you, Craig. Thanks for everything you do. And thank you for everybody who joined us today.
Yes, thanks. Great discussion.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.